Hi, everyone, and welcome to What's New in Historical Fiction. This is a regular panel series featuring historical novelists with new and upcoming titles. So glad that you could be here, take time out of your day to hear about these great authors, to hear about these great novels. It's always a lot of fun, and we appreciate you being here and supporting us in this way. Please go ahead and say hello in the chat and let us know where you're joining us from. You can turn your cameras on or off. It's totally up to you. I have disabled the mics just so there are no distractions. But if you have any questions for our panelists at any time during the discussion, just post those in the chat. I will be monitoring those. I also have a link to our panelist novels, which I'll post a couple times throughout the chat, just a landing page that shows you where you can find their books. And those are linked to bookshop.org because we want to support independent booksellers, and bookshop.org donates a percentage of their proceeds to independent bookstores. So that's really it from me. I'm Colin Mustful. I'm the founder and editor of History Through Fiction. I'm going to remove myself from the screen, and then I'll let these panelists introduce themselves. So let me just unpin myself. So to start off, let's say hello to Molly McNett, author of Child of These Tears. Molly, hello.
Hi, nice
Could
to
you
be
could you just briefly tell us about Child of These Tears?
here. Yes, this is a historical novel that's based on captivity narratives. So um, it it is its point of departure is the story of Eunice Williams, who was taken captive by Mohawk and French soldiers in 1704 in Deerfield, Massachusetts, and marched to Canada, where she was taken into a mission. And her story is one of separation and loss. Actually, she forgot how to speak English and never returned to her parents. My story is sort of a fictionalized version that takes the same point of departure but changes a little bit in its characters and so on. And there are different genres represented: captivity narrative and commonplace book, as well as a young girl's point of view, and the Jesuit relations are also represented in the form of letters.
Well, it sounds like a fascinating history, and I look forward to asking you more about that during this panel. Next, we have Carol Cram. Carol is actually a history through fiction author, so we are proud to publish her novel, The Choir, which came out yesterday. Carol,
Yes.
hi.
Hi, how are you doing? Nice to see everybody. So do you want me to talk? My novel, as Colin said, is called The Choir. So the original spark for it came from a family mystery. When I was young, my grandmother used to talk about the first and second families. Her grandmother, my great-great-grandmother, who became Eliza in the novel, had 6 children with one man, left him, and then had 7 more children with another. She was a busy woman. But I always wondered, how did she leave the first guy? Nothing was ever said in the family. But how does a working class woman in a Yorkshire mill town in the 1890s just walk away from a marriage? She had no money, no legal power, and a house full of children. So as I started researching the period, I found out about the music competition movement that was sweeping Victorian England, particularly in the north. My grandmother had a beautiful singing voice, so I decided that Eliza did too, and that forming a choir and entering a music competition would be how she managed to leave husband number one. I then invented Ruth, who was Eliza's best friend when they were young, and she was able to leave the mill town and became a star on the London stage. So the novel is 2 stories. It's Eliza's story getting out of her bad situation, and it's Ruth's story, who is actually a fall from grace because she's a big star, and then things don't go well.
Well, it's a really lovely story of sisterhood, and people so far have really been resonating for them. Next, we
Yeah,
have,
people are really liking it, which is awesome.
yeah, we have Isabelle Schuler here, and she is the author of The House of Barbary. Hello, Isabelle.
Hello. Oh, sorry, Kat. Really good timing. Yeah, my name is Isabelle Schuler, and The House of Barbary is my second book. The first book was, which I won't talk about, but it was set in early medieval Scotland, and this is set in 17th century Switzerland, which is a completely different era. So had to start the research all over again. But essentially, it's actually a retelling of a French fairy tale. And it begins with we meet Beatrice, who is a young woman in the city of Bern. And her father has just passed away under mysterious circumstances. And so the book sort of follows her journey as she tries to unpick what really happened. But it's also set against the backdrop of Bern at the time, which was this exploding city. It had sort of I think it was one of the highest populations of any city in Switzerland at the time. And so as she's sort of discovering all of these things, the city itself is also kind of bursting with activity and also with conflict. So that is, yeah, that's the book.
What's the name of the original fairy tale?
Bluebeard. It's the
Okay.
Bluebeard fairy tale. Yeah.
Sounds like a lot went into forming that narrative around history and around retelling. So that sounds
Yeah.
wonderful.
Yeah, it was. It was. Well, yeah. Did you want me to
Well,
elaborate more? Will that come later? Sorry, I was confused.
oh, sure. Go ahead. Why don't you elaborate for us?
Oh, yeah. Well, it was interesting because I think for this story, I started with the idea of wanting to uh, do a retelling of the French fairy tale Bluebeard, which, if you don't know it, the things sort of top line notes, it's very, very gruesome. It features a man who ultimately punishes a woman for being curious or wants to punishes women for being curious, but then eventually gets his comeuppance in very strange ways. But I was really interested in this idea of kind of switching that and turning that narrative upside down because the moral of that particular fairy tale is I think it's something like many a grief a woman has experienced for being overly curious. And I sort of wanted to say that surely many an evil has gone undiscovered when women aren't curious. Um, and so sort of had that framework of the fairy tale, but really wasn't sure where to set it. My father's from Switzerland, so I have a heritage in Switzerland. So I sort of started there as a location and then was drawn to the 17th century because it was so violent. And it was so, we see also just within art and theater, or what it was at the time, this real play of light and dark and kind of pushing things to the absolute limit, with sort of the Baroque art period as well. And so I thought, given a story with sort of such violent, extreme um, endings, then I thought that would situate well in, yeah, that particular time period.
Well, definitely a lot of interesting threads to weave together.
Mm.
Finally, we have Kerry Chaput, author of The Secret Courtesan. Kerry, hi.
Hi, Colin, you said my name correctly. I'm very impressed.
Oh, good. I forgot to ask.
No, you did great. The Secret Courtesan is been out for about 2 weeks now, and it's a dual timeline narrative. And it is the story of an unearthed erotic statue in Venice, and a modern historian has to prove that the artist was not the famous male artist that the world believes, but was actually his courtesan who was erased by history.
And why don't you tell us a little bit about that story and how you came across it?
Well, my whole platform is based off of badass women in history and women who have done these incredible things but have been completely erased from the historical narrative. And this book kind of came out of my anger of reading about all of these erased women over and over and over again, and reading about their incredible feats that they've done and contributions, and just getting completely wiped away. And I've always been sort of fascinated with courtesans, especially in Venice, because of their contribution to the art world. They were given access to education and the arts, and they were musicians and writers and poets, and had access to some political, power and some intellectual power that most women were not, especially even royal women did not have that. So it was this really unique niche to be able to talk about women's art. And you look at Renaissance artists, and you hardly ever hear about women artists. You have a few painters, you have Artemisia Gentileschi, you have a few ones, but you never hear about sculptors. And in my mind, I'm like, I know they were there, I know they were doing it, they just got erased. And so I wanted to tell that story. And then it also kind of brings in with the modern storyline how I feel as an author reading through historical documents, trying to find really what the propaganda wasn't telling, and who are the people that were kind of hiding behind and the ones that were erased, actively erased. And so the modern historian, it really represents me trying to piece out another side of the story.
You're kind of doing two things at once there. You're doing the research, and the research itself is allowing you to tell the story of the character, it sounds like.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a really fast-paced narrative. I go back and forth between 400 years. And it was really a lot of fun to write. And I put a lot of kind of the passion, but also kind of the frustration and rage that I was feeling with all of these women artists being erased. And so it was great to be able to take one of those kind of fictional, amalgamation of these characters into a fictional character and let her just completely take over the page. That was really fun.
Sure. Yeah, that sounds fantastic. Well, let's go back to Molly. Molly, why don't you introduce us to our fifth panelist first?
Oh,
This is Morty.
Okay.
Yeah.
Morty
And
looks very
he's
comfortable.
not usually very friendly. I don't know why. He must be attracted to the subject.
Well, Molly, I want to ask you about the setting, Hartfield Falls. First of all, is that a real place? And then if you could elaborate a little bit on the political and cultural context of that time and place set, during your novel.
Yeah, Hartfield Falls is a made-up name. As I said, I based this story very loosely on the raid of Deerfield, Massachusetts in 1704. So, in this time, there were English colonists living there, obviously, in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. And there were also, this was during the time of Queen Anne's War. So there were periodic raids, the French enlisting the help of, in that area, the Mohawk Indians, to raid these hamlets and sometimes take prisoners. Very often, this was because the Mohawk tribes had a reduced population due to smallpox and other diseases. And so they would take prisoners, and often children, and then absorb them into their communities. This was the hope anyway. And then these interesting conflicts ensued where the English colonists tried to get their children back, or it was women, children, sometimes men also were taken, and then the French governor was involved often, or sometimes the native peoples were also brought into the conversation, and there were negotiations essentially for prisoners.
In your research, I'm just curious, were you having to research French documents or documents perhaps even in English that weren't easily transcribable?
Yeah, I did. I mean, I looked at a lot of documents. I looked at French. I looked at the correspondence between the French governor Dudley, or the English governor Dudley, and the French Vaudreuil. At that time, there was a lot of correspondence going back and forth between them. And then also the Jesuit relations were really helpful. If you haven't read them, I suggest it for anyone who's interested in letters that give a lot of history, but also a personal touch. And so I was able to kind of follow the events, but as I fictionalized them, so I was able to make up some things, but following sort of the broad framework of what I knew happened at that time.
Sure. Well, it just sounds like there was a lot coming together in one place. And so it must have had a lot of things to kind of filter through.
Yeah. Yes, points of view. I mean, I think what's so interesting to me is to see the absolute opposition between the Protestant point of view in New England and the Catholic one in coming from the mission in Canada and the French governor. So, I mean, we see this kind of divide today, I suppose, and it's pretty strong. It's almost to the point where you can't understand the other side. And that was certainly going on there. And it was strong enough that maybe the biggest fear that people had was that their child would be taken and convinced that the other side was right and be converted, which did happen. And that was not only a terrible thing for this lifetime, but for eternity. It meant that you would be cursed essentially. And so, yeah, it was a very, very, very tense situation in which the participants had real trouble seeing the other side as being human.
Sure. Well, what a valuable thing to go back and study and convey to readers, and just gives us some perspective, certainly. Well, Carol, let's talk about Ruth and Eliza. I consider your story kind of character driven. Can you talk about what it was like to get to know these women, not just Ruth and Eliza, but all the women in the choir, and how they developed over time as you created this narrative?
Okay, so how I got to know these characters. Yeah, it's interesting how they just kind of develop on the page. When I sit down to write, I don't actually, an initial scene, I don't really know what's going to happen. So yeah, I don't know, they just kind of grew. I mean, I didn't know my great great grandmother, obviously, so I had to invent Eliza, and then Ruth was a complete invention. And just how to figure out how these women would have navigated through that time, which was pretty constrained for women. Even like Ruth, for example, was actually more upper class because she kind of made the big time until things kind of didn't go well, as I said earlier. But still, they both had enormous constraints put upon them. So, kind of looking into that and seeing some of the parallels too with women, throughout history. I think it's interesting that we're all writing about, marginalized women or women's stories often being erased. Like Kerry, I love the art one, as my first novel's about a woman artist. So I don't know. Yeah, that's I don't quite know what more to say about that, but it was certainly a wonderful experience working with trying to bring these two women to life. I think that's why we write novels, because we want to play with these people and see what they do on the page. I don't know if you guys agree with that, but that's sort of the most exciting thing I find. What are they going to do? What are they going to say? Because I don't often know. I don't know if other people think that.
Yeah, agreed.
Yeah.
Well, Isabelle, let's talk about one of those women in your book, which is Beatrice, the character you used to tell this story. So tell us about who Beatrice is and the situation that she actually finds herself in.
Yeah, so like I said earlier, Beatrice is a young woman in Bern. Her father is one of the mayors in Bern. I could do a whole segment on just the fascinating politics of Switzerland generally, because obviously they didn't have a monarchy, which they're very proud of. But also at this particular time, there were two mayors, and they would take it in turns. 1 year after one year after the other. So there'd be the standing mayor and the resting mayor. And this sort of plays in the book a bit as well. But as you can expect, oftentimes the mayors didn't necessarily get on. So you'd have one mayor in for a year doing all sorts of things, and then the next mayor the next year would undo everything, and they would just go back and forth for a decade. And so that's sort of some of the politics that she suddenly finds herself in when her father, who was one of the mayors, um, dies, and actually he's murdered in her home, and she discovers him, which of course is quite traumatizing. And Beatrice herself, she's not based on anyone. Well, actually, I'd tell a lie. um, Very, very, very loosely based on this woman. Gosh, I apologize. The book came out just over a year ago, so I'm now struggling to remember all my references. But she was a famous taxidermist at the time, and she's actually responsible for the discovery that butterflies happen. People used to think that butterflies were born from the ground because they couldn't see obviously they couldn't see the process from like caterpillar to cocoon to butterflies. And so she was able to actually, I think it was moths, she was able to track that. But it was really interesting because obviously that particular work wasn't seen as suitable for a woman. And Beatrice is herself, she has a very scientific mind, and her father has always really encouraged that. And so, but also in doing that, has sort of sheltered her from the outside world. So when he dies, she kind of has absolutely no idea how to move through or in society. And so, and also she sort of gets quite fixated on this idea that the story that the government are telling about her father's murder is perhaps not the truth. And so, in the same way that she sort of applies her scientific mind to her animals and her creatures, she sort of turns that on to discovering the truth about her father. I should have said as well, it is actually mine's dual narrative as well. And I sometimes forget that, which is such a disservice to my beloved Johann. But the second character is this portrait artist. Portraiture was at a really interesting point again in the 1600s, just because all sorts of things were changing about perspective and whatnot. And so his storyline takes place, I think it's like 12 years earlier. And so you get the perspective on her father from both her sort of reeling from his death and starting to understand that while he was a wonderful father, maybe he wasn't the person she thought he was, and his ultimate demise may be connected to that in some way. And then you have this other character who's quite outside the family. And so you sort of are seeing this story from like many, many different angles, which is part of the fun. I love a fast-paced book. I love reading them. I love writing them. I'm not particularly contemplative, and so just yeah, being able to kind of move on with the story. I wanted something that was constantly back and forth. I think I've lost the trail of the question, but that's yeah.
Is there anything in particular from a craft perspective that you do to maintain that fast pace or create it for the reader?
Yeah, I think I don't know if anyone else wants to talk about this as well, but I find the idea of agency really compelling, both who has it, um, and kind of trying to give my character as much agency as possible, but especially for her because of the situation she finds herself in. She sort of doesn't know, she's just really so clueless because she's been so sheltered. Um, and she's sort of understanding and discovering all these things about her father and her childhood that she from a completely different perspective. um and so I think that like the conflict between that kind of lent itself quite well to that pace, because she's constantly trying to figure out what her next step should be, and then she's misstepping, so she's having to then compensate for that. And so that sort of for me, I think that really drove the narrative without it feeling, well, actually, to be fair, this is on the reader, not me, but what I was trying, hopefully it doesn't feel like it's rushed or just lots of things are happening. It's a lot of it is I think a lot of that pace I hoped and I tried to feed with her own internal conflict and how that's manifesting in the decisions that she's making.
Carol, that reminds me a bit of Eliza, who's kind of getting tripped up by Reg or finances or motherhood, having to reassess
Oh
what
yeah,
to
because
do
a
next.
lot of the story is really about Eliza, not just getting away from her husband. That's sort of like the surface story, but underneath it's her character, because she's blocked herself off from everybody. She doesn't want anything to be, she's ashamed of what things are, and she's become very stern. And so part of the novel, part of her story is her opening up and accepting help, accepting sisterhood, which is where the choir comes in, because she helps to form a choir of all these working class women, and they're pretty feisty gals. But through working with them, and Eliza learns to be vulnerable, which is not easy for her to do.
Well, Kerry, let's talk about the characters in your novel. You have a dual timeline, Dr. Mia Harding and Sophia Rossi. What did Mia discover about Sophia, and how did you tie these stories together, tie these characters together?
I'm the same as Isabelle. I love fast paced. It's totally my jam. I really was inspired by like the Da Vinci Code style of book, where you have the two timelines happening and you kind of leave on a cliffhanger and jump back to the other time. And then, that kind of keeps the pace going for me. And Dr. Harding is really in a race to get answers, and it's like getting pieces of a puzzle. And so each time she moves to a new space, her and another researcher end up going to Venice, and they're there and they're doing research, but they're being watched because she's expected to authenticate this statue. Millions of dollars rest on this, and lots of museums want this to move forward, and she's holding everything up to try to get the truth. So I, at one point, had to sort of stop writing the modern timeline and just write the historical all the way through, and then come back and work in the modern line, because I couldn't write a puzzle without having the pieces yet. So it was really fun, though, to write these two timelines 400 years apart, because so much of Venice is the same over 400 years, the layout and the palace and the grid and everything. And so the places that one character moves through, the other character moves through in the next chapter, just 400 years later. So I tried to weave those through together quite a bit. And then I'll have one character kind of remark, she'll look at something and think, I wonder if this will still be here in a few hundred years. And then we go to the next chapter and we see our modern character actually looking at the same thing. I loved tying those together.
That's cool.
Can I ask a question?
Of
Is that allowed?
course. Yes.
This is kind of, well, I guess for all three of you, but especially Carol, for because your book is set in Yorkshire, right? And yeah, Kerry's set in Venice. Oh, you're muted. Oh, Carol needs to be unmuted. Anyway, I'll keep asking my question. How did you do research on the actual place? Did you go to Venice? Did you go to Yorkshire? Did you go to the places, or did you have to rely on the internet?
Well, actually, first off, I want to say, Kerry, you just gave me a really great idea, just
Okay.
listening to you. Well, I just love that idea of Venice, and that you could have your character, your chapters, like she's looking at the Doge's palace, and then 400 years
Barely
later
lost
she's
her
looking at the
sound, at
Doge. In
least
other
I
words, things
did.
haven't changed, and I just love the idea of setting your novel in a place where you could do that. So now my mind's going, ooh, I wonder what anyway.
Get it, Carol.
We never know where we're going to get ideas. But for me, yes, I did go to Yorkshire. I lived in England when I was young. My heritage is English. My grandmother was from Yorkshire. She was born in Yorkshire. I knew my great grandmother, not the great, but I did know my great grandmother. So it's kind of, when I was writing, especially Eliza, I could hear my grandmother. I could hear the cadence of her voice, and this novel actually was a real labor of love, because I started writing it when my mother was still with us, and she helped me a lot. She was an amazing woman, and she did a lot to help with the research. But anyway, yeah, I always go to where my novels are set. I mean, hey, it's one of the reasons we write novels set in cool places, right?
Yeah, definitely.
I'm really sad I missed that answer. My audio switched to a different speaker. Carol, you were very animated, and I missed the whole thing, so I'll have to go back and watch the recording.
Just repeat it all, Carol.
What about you, Kerry or Molly?
I had been to Venice a handful of times, mostly in my younger years. So I definitely, I knew the feeling of being there, and I knew what it was like to walk the streets. And so I had that, but I wrote this kind of as we were coming out of the end of COVID, and traveling to Venice was just not in the cards for us. And so I did have to rely a lot on the internet. And you know what? Google Maps, the street view is surprisingly helpful, because when you write a high action book, you have to be oriented at all times. I have to know exactly when I walk to the end of this hall, does it go right? Does it go left? What's out the window? What am I looking at? So I spent weeks just making my own maps and doing Google, like I'd go walk through the Doge's Palace with Google Maps Street View, and I'd watch it and I'd turn the corners and I'd draw my own map, so that when I wrote the scenes, I was really oriented to what it actually looked like. But I'm with you, Carol. If I could have been in Venice, I would have been there. No problem. I wish I could have.
Now you can go for your next novel.
Yes, I will have to.
Kerry, I'm curious. So are you writing a scene and then pausing to look at Google Maps, or do you look ahead of time, draw out the map and know so you don't have to be interrupted from your writing?
Oh, I have such a manic process. I'd like to tell you that I was completely prepared, but no, I frequently had to stop in the middle, which is really frustrating. And I'd be like, oh, I cannot write this sentence until I know exactly where it goes. And then at one point, I did force myself to just pause everything and spend about 2 weeks, I think, just really researching and drawing maps. And I've had to do that for most of my books. So, but it is helpful, because then you can just write forward instead of being stopped every other sentence.
Well, it is just fascinating to know how much work goes into it, and that anyone reading these novels, like, yes, we're making things up, but no, you're not making things up. You're making sure to get things right and authentic. And thank you for that question, Isabelle. If any of our audience members have a question, go ahead and post that in the chat. Like I said, I'll be monitoring that, and we can ask our panelists whatever question you might have. Let's go back to Molly. Molly, correct me if I'm wrong, is this your debut?
It's my first novel. I've been writing short stories for many, many years. And so I've been writing historical short fiction as well. And so this one, oh, this is chilly. We have three. My sister gave me a bag, a tote bag for Christmas, and it says one cat short of crazy, something like that.
One more, and you're the crazy cat
Yes,
lady.
3 cats, and it's kind of a circus.
Uh-huh.
But anyway, so yeah, so it is my first novel, and I only wrote it because I had an agent that I was talking to who said the thing that agents always say to short story writers, which is, I'd love to sell this, but you have to have a novel. And I did have a story. I mean, I started this whole book with a captivity narrative, which when I was in graduate school, we read a lot of captivity narratives, and they're interesting because they're really the first bestsellers in the New World, and so starting with Mary Rowlandson's captivity narrative, if any of you have read it in the 17th century, these tales of especially women taken, into the wilderness and then redeemed by God. This was usually the point of view of the narrative. And I just love the language of them. And I think sometimes I don't know what I'm doing with writing, but I love the sound of something, some letters or historical documents or something. And I want to sort of mimic that or hear it in my head. Hopefully at some point it will become more than just a pastiche, but that's the idea that I usually start with. And so I wrote a captivity narrative as a sort of short story. It was just an experiment. I thought, let's see if I could do this. And I wrote it really pretty much beginning to end. But then I didn't know what it was doing. I mean, I sort of had the sound of it, but there wasn't anything beyond what one might find in a captivity narrative. And so I sort of sat on that. And then a few years later, I started reading the Jesuit Relations once they became available online. I can't remember, but we also have them I work at a university. We have them in our library, and they're the dual language books, so you get that 17th, 18th century French alongside the English translation, which is also a little antiquated in its tone. And so I just spent hours with those. I didn't know what I was doing. I don't know about all of you, but I waste enormous amounts of time just doing this in the name of research, but I know that it's not. I know 90% of it or more is going to be wasted, but I don't really feel it's wasted because I really adore doing it. So I just spent a lot of time with that. And so when this agent suggested, perhaps you'll write a novel out of one of these historical short stories, I thought, well, I have the relations and I have this captivity narrative I've already done. Maybe I could start adding more voices on top of that. And so that's how that started. And you might be interested to know that once I got all done with the novel, of course, the agent didn't want it and suggested that I take all these different voices and genres that I had woven together so carefully and make it into just one voice, the girls, and have that be the whole story. And I spent probably 2 or 3 weeks feeling really, really sorry for myself, just crying and feeling also like I grieving maybe these other characters. And then I thought, like, why must it be this particular agent? Why not look around a little more? And then I was lucky enough to find this press that did understand it and did want it, and they were lovely to work with too, which I kind of wonder with the other experience, have been the same in terms of this sort of work on the manuscript and so on. Like, I feel like it was better, even though it really wasn't what I wanted. I had my I have my sights set on this one thing that I thought that I wanted. But now I'd say I'm glad to have failed that first round and been sort of forced into another route.
So much of writing and being an author is pivoting, like all the time, adjusting expectations, changing original plans. I think that's the surprise of it, is that like we're never done shifting goals and plans and mindsets.
Yeah. Well, I have to chime in because House of Barbary was the dreaded second book, which everyone, sorry, not to scare you, Molly, but the second book, at least I found second books are the worst. Because yeah, I'd found it very difficult. And there's all sorts of reasons for that. But with my first book, I'd actually done remarkably little editing on it. So I didn't actually have to change a whole lot just because I tinkered with it so much. Whereas with House of Barbary, the second draft was a 100% rewrite, which there is an entire version of this story that just doesn't exist. And it's about 100,000 words, but just had to I realized it just wasn't working. So yeah, so much, I mean, that was like a 180 pivot. And then interestingly, the third draft was then almost a 50% rewrite. So House of Barbary really was quite grueling, and it's sort of combing through what works and what doesn't.
I can say the same about the choir too. I went through so many different iterations, and then I got a wonderful editor through History Through Fiction, and I thought it was completely done. I thought, okay, it's great. This is a great novel, and her feedback was amazing. But as a result, I had to do like another 40% rewrite, and but it made it a better novel. So yeah, we're constantly rejigging and rethinking. I wish that we could just sit down and write it straight through and it would be perfect, but I don't think anybody does that. They do that in the movies, but
Well, and even the title, Carol, was a last second change.
totally last second change. I had a hard time on it. Titles are funny. They either come right away or they don't. And then suddenly, right at the very end, like we were weeks from publication, I thought, well, let's just keep it simple. The Choir. Oh, okay, that works.
What was it before?
And I really like the title now.
I don't
What
even
was
remember, Carol. What was some of the other titles?
The original one, well, one of the originals was Mill Song, but nobody understood what that meant. I don't even know if I understood because it takes place in a mill town, cotton mill town in Yorkshire, and working class women. And because one of the whole things of the novel is I really wanted to explore working class women, my ancestors, because my ancestors weren't living in palaces, right? Most of ours weren't. But anyway, I had a bunch of them, but that was one of them. But anyway, the choir was just simple. Like sometimes you just keep it simple. Actually, it's because I interviewed someone on my podcast who'd written a novel called The Band. And after I finished interviewing, I thought, wait a minute, that's a really good title. I'll just call it The Choir. So, you never know. Titles are interesting where they come from. Did
What?
everybody have your titles first, or how did you get your titles? I don't know if people are interested in that, but
Well, mine comes from Saint Augustine.
okay.
And so well, you might know the story of Augustine, who was his mother was went to the priest and was crying about his being he's deep in the Manichaean faith at the time, and she was a Christian, and she was telling telling the priest he had to do something about this. And the priest said, well, I'm going to butcher this, and it's a translation anyway, what I'm saying, but the priest said to her as she was sobbing that the child of these tears will never be lost, or never will
Oh,
um so anyway, this because this is a story about a child who's essentially lost to her parents' Protestant way of thinking. That's how I got that title.
That's a beautiful story.
Mhm.
I think this discussion is just a wonderful testament for the work of historical novelists, just to kind of see how you really just put yourself out there. You don't know what the final product is going to be, or if it's where it's going to land, or if it will end in failure, quote unquote. Um, so just want to applaud all of you for the work that you do, and the time you put into it, and all that effort, and accepting the criticism and the feedback to change and to shift, as Kerry said. So I think that's great. Kerry, you talked a little bit, or I'm sorry, Isabelle, you talked a little bit earlier about Bluebeard and how this is adapted from a fairy tale. Molly kind of adapted hers from a short story. Can you talk a little bit, Isabelle, about adapting a fairy tale, and how much of it did you have to keep in the narrative so that it was, noticeable? And were there any concerns about changing it too much or not enough? Any pushback from people who are purists for this fairy tale?
Well, thankfully, Bluebeard isn't up there. It's not like Beauty and the Beast or one of these, or The Little Mermaid. So I didn't have any pushback. I think there was, I remember early conversations where we weren't sure whether I mean, it was always, I don't know if even retelling is the right word, maybe reimagining, or I don't know, there's a better word for it. We sort of wondered if Bluebeard was going to be too distracting and whether we should just let the story stand on its own, which I just thought was an interesting angle to retellings, because it seems like everything is about a retelling. But actually, in this case, it was sort of, yeah, we really did think about how much to put that in the publicity. I think when it comes to retellings, for me, I love retellings, because I love being able to come back to the stories that we all know and love and explore them from a different angle. Um, and so for, for me, part of I feel like I now have to tell you just a very short abbreviated version of the Bluebeard fairy tale if you don't know it. Um, but basically, it's about a very old man who is very rich, but according to the tale, very ugly because he has a blue beard. And he convinces a young woman in his village to marry him. She shows up to the house shortly after they get married. He gives her the keys to his home, to his stately home, says he's going away for business. And she can go anywhere she wants except in the basement. And then he says bye. Of course, the very first thing she does is she goes into the basement, where she finds all of his previous wives hung up on meat hooks. Oh, sorry. I don't know. There probably should have been a content warning in that. It's very, very violent, as so many fairy tales are. And she drops the key, and it turns out that it's a magical key, and there gets some dried blood on it. So then she tries to wash it off, and it's not coming off. At which point her husband returns because he never actually went away. And this was all a big test. And it sort of sits very squarely in the like Pandora's box myth and in the sort of Eve and the apple and sort of this idea of this woman does or goes where she isn't supposed to go. And tragedy befalls. And actually, in the French fairy tale, she sort of manages to squirrel her way out of it. And ends up killing him and living happily ever after, which is sort of a PhD on its own. But one of the things that I've known that fairy tale for a very long time. And the thing that I was always really interested in is what would it be like if someone like that had a daughter? Because my father is wonderful and I have a very good relationship with him. But there's something in that relationship and in that dynamic of fathers and daughters. And I've heard and I know people very close to sort of very big cases in the UK and in Europe where the daughters believe their fathers are innocent when all of the evidence points to the fact that they are not. And so for me, that was that in terms of retelling that story, you can see why it's not really a straight retelling. It's sort of this idea of this young woman trying to figure out who her father actually is. And also, I really was interested in that, in exploring. Like the great thing about fairy tales is they often have these big themes in them, right? These big ideas that they explore. Um, and with that one, I was really interested in this idea of the sort of binary good and bad that we have. Like, can someone be a horrible person and a wonderful father? Like, does that exist? How do we cope with that? How do we feel about that as a society? Does it redeem the character? Does it not? Um, so I don't really give answers, but it was just, I think for me, the great thing about retellings is it allows you, like I said, to sort of get back into those stories and ask questions and ask new questions and not necessarily answer them, but just throw it out there and see what people do with it.
A lot of very interesting dynamics there and like definitely important questions to ask and to investigate. So yeah, I think that's great.
Yeah, thanks. Oh, sorry. One thing I'll say, and I don't know if you guys find this as well, but obviously people often ask me like, why do you write historical fiction? Um, oh, has this frozen? Nope.
I
Okay, we're
don't
good.
think so.
Sorry. I thought it wigged out.
We're all
Um,
listening.
and one of the things that I love about history in some ways is that nothing changes. Nothing has really changed. Like systems change and governments change and policies change, but for the most part, people are still doing and behaving in the exact same way that they did when we first started telling stories, however many tens of thousands, I think the oldest story is like 10,000 years old, but like however many years ago, we still we still love, we still hate, we don't seem to have changed much as a creature. And that just for me is fascinating. I love that you can tell a story that is 400 years old or 1,000 years old and people more or less behave the same way. I don't know. What do you guys, why are you drawn to historical fiction?
I can tell you why I'm drawn to it. I I want to explore history in a way that brings people into that history and helps make it relatable to them and understandable to them in a way that just traditional nonfiction history does not. And obviously, that emotional impact you reach at the end just resonates with people, and I think it's a way to get them interested to the point where they look beyond the facts and want to really understand the time and the place and the people, even though those people might be so far removed from us today. We have a question from Greg that's somewhat similar. Greg's always good for a question. Thank you, Greg. He says, works of historical fiction seem to find a place on a continuum between history and fiction. Where do you locate your work on that continuum, and how does that inform your writing? So I suppose I can go for any of you. How do you balance the history and the fiction and in your stories, when does the narrative take precedence over the history?
I'll start with that one. I always start with the story, with the people, the characters. You know, as Isabelle said, people have not really changed. And I'm not writing novels about big historical events. They're set in an historical time, but really they're about my characters and how they think and feel. So I would say in terms of a continuum, I'm more on the fiction side than the history side, but I happen to set things in places and times that I find interesting, really is where it is. And I love history. I didn't study it per se, but I just love history. I like so yeah, I would say I'm much more on the fiction side.
Molly, how about you? Did you like you did a lot of research for this? Did you have any challenges in translating that research into a narrative, and where did you draw the line as far as fictionalizing it?
I think it's difficult. Sometimes it's difficult for me while I am doing the research to begin the process of fictionalizing it, because somehow I want to stay true to the source material. And it takes a great leap to, but I think, as Carol said, you have to leap with your characters. So it took me a while to sort of trust the characters enough as themselves and feel like I knew them somehow to let me go, kind of move away from the source material. Mhm.
I found myself doing that earlier this week. I'm working on a draft of a novel, and there is a specific historical event where people are going from one place to a next, and the character in the real history, the characters got separated. One of them hid in the woods, and the other one took a wagon to a safe place. And I was stuck with that because it didn't make sense for them to separate at that point based on the decision that was coming later for one of the characters. And I'm proud of myself. I went away from what the historical record was because I told myself, nope, this isn't history. I can change it for the benefit of that decision for one of the characters later. So yay for
Well,
me.
Yay.
yeah, even to, sorry to jump in, but just even to affirm you in that, like, I think we sometimes, like, obviously the events are documented, so I'm not saying history doesn't exist, but the interpretation of history is, that whole idea of history being told by the victors. I think we sometimes view history a little bit too concretely, and even the things that we're being told are being told by people. So the numbers of things, or like I think especially about like battles, and like from one side you'll get, oh, they were absolutely decimated, and then the other is like, oh, it was a skirmish and we didn't do great. Like history is not nearly as concrete as we want it to be. Certainly our ability to engage with it certainly is concrete in its own sense, but without that, without being in it, we can't see it. And so I think for me, my whole thing, I do so much research, and I believe in very robust historical notes at the end of novels, because I feel like I like being on the more fiction side, and I am quite comfortable that as long as the world is real and there's nothing anachronistic within the world, I will change everything, because that's my prerogative as a historical fiction writer. And I know some historical fiction writers who would severely disagree with that, even say that that's disrespectful. But that's again why I believe in robust historical notes, because if you can sort of say, oh no, I do respect history, this is what happened, but this is my imagination, this is a thing to entertain and for people to enjoy and engage with, then yeah, it is kind of our prerogative to break the rules. Kerry, what
It's
about you?
historical
Sorry.
fiction.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think the word that I always come up with is it plausible within the context of the time? Because you don't want to be anachronistic. That's sort of like our greatest fear. Well,
Mm.
one of them. But yeah, is it plausible that such and such could have happened in the context of that period? And then off you go. As I say, I'm not an historian. I'm a writer.
Well, I think that fiction, regardless of genre, comes down to getting a story about someone's life, how they change, how they grow. And history for me is just another vehicle to show that growth and put them in a really interesting place that forces in this external setting, forces them to challenge themselves and find a bigger purpose and find this thing that they're trying to do. And I would say that my why for why I write historical fiction was solidified pretty early in life. So I grew up in the 80s, and my dad was a US history teacher, and he held his honors class in our living room every Thursday night from the time I was a little kid. So I was like a toddler hiding behind the couch, listening to high schoolers debate history. This is how I grew up. So history was a living, breathing thing in my world that was constantly being debated. And they'd all debate one side. And then if everyone came believing one side, they'd all debate my dad on the other side. So every year I heard different perspectives on the same thing. Every year it was different based off who came to the table. And so around 8 years old, I remember hiding behind the couch and listening and thinking, all we're talking about is men. Every single conversation, every single week, every single year. I don't hear one story about a woman. And I didn't think much. I was 8. I was like, why are they talking about women? I literally didn't think women existed until recently. At my little 8-year-old brain, I thought it was, well, men must have just been around longer. And that moment changed the trajectory of my life. I didn't realize it for years, but I want little girls to see themselves represented in history. It's not all about battles. It's not all about kings. It's about people. And that's what I grew up listening to, was people and motivations and why we do what we do and how we change and how we grow. And so to this day, that's what drives me to write fiction. And I can do it in the space of a historical story, which is so fun to build on facts. But I'm all fiction at the heart of the story.
Well, I think that's very well articulated there. You guys you're asking bigger questions than just what happened second by second, minute by minute. And as was already pointed out, like, we don't necessarily know if that was true anyway. So Kerry's mission there and what she's accomplishing and what all of you are accomplishing is just wonderful, to ask those bigger questions and to get us to discuss those things and try to understand why weren't women represented in history and how can we change that. So I think that's great. Well, I always end these panels with the same question, and that is, what is the value of historical fiction? But Isabelle already asked the question, Kerry already articulated it. And we're up against the hour here. So let me thank our panelists. This has been a really excellent discussion. I'm going to post the link to that landing page once again. Now that all of you know more about these novels, go ahead and check them out. If you cannot buy books right now, that's totally okay. You can get them from your library. You can request them from the library if they don't have them. You can tell your friends about these books. You can post about them on social media. Anything and everything to tell people about these books, to tell people about these histories is wonderful. And just being here today, we really appreciate it. So thanks to our panelists, thanks to our audience. This has been a lot of fun. And one last note, we don't have another panel set until May. I do this once every 1 or 2 months. We have a conference next month and some other stuff going on. So we'll be back with What's New in Historical Fiction with 2 panels in May and another in June. So I look forward to seeing all of you for those. But thanks again, everyone.
Thank you.
Rush. Thank you. Bye-bye.
All of you women, you inspired me.
Yeah, same. And hey, I didn't realize this was your debut. Congratulations.
Thank you.
That's amazing. Is there are you guys on social media? Is there a way to connect outside of
I'm on Facebook, but that's all.
I'll send an email out and
Okay, great. Sorry.